The family forced their daughter to marry a very old stranger for a cow. What happened next? Bitter Creek, Kansas, late 1800s. The prairie stretched wide and empty. The land cracked open like a thirsty mouth. Wind howled across the plains, carrying with it nothing but dust. Dust in the air, dust in the water troughs, dust in the lungs of every man, woman, and child. The cattle were dying. One by one they fell, their ribs showing, their hides sagging like old leather bags. The town of Bitter Creek had once thrived on cattle drives and cornfields, but now it was a graveyard of dreams. Inside a small homestead, the Johnson family sat around their wooden table. The mother, Anna Johnson, held an empty flour sack in her lap, fingers stroking the cloth like she might coax bread from it by prayer alone. Beside her, the father, Silas Johnson, stared at the floor, his jaw set, his hands cracked and blistered from working soil that would not give. 17-year-old Mary Johnson moved quietly between them, pouring the last drops of water into her little brother's tin cup. The boy, barely 9, drank eagerly, then looked up with hollow eyes. "Boy, weakly, is there more, Mary?" Mary, softly, forcing a smile, "Tomorrow, Sam. Tomorrow there'll be more." But even as she said it, her heart sank. Tomorrow would bring no rain. Tomorrow would bring no miracle. The silence in that little house was heavy, broken only by the groaning of the wind through the cracks in the boards. Then hoofbeats. A lone rider approached, the sound echoing in the stillness. The Johnson family stepped to the door, shading their eyes from the blinding sun. An old man rode into their yard on a tired horse. His back was bent like a bow, his beard long and gray, his clothes worn thin but neatly kept. Behind him, tethered by a rope, walked a single cow, bony but alive, udders still swollen with milk. The rider stopped, slid down from the saddle with slow, deliberate movements, and tipped his hat. "Old man, name's Jedediah Crow." Silas Johnson swallowed hard. He'd heard the name. Everyone in Bitter Creek had. Jedediah Crow, an old rancher, a man who'd buried 3 wives and had no children. Folks whispered he was cursed, that death walked close behind him wherever he went. But in that moment, all Silas saw was the cow. Anna's hand clutched at her chest, her eyes fixed on the animal like it was salvation itself. Anna, whispering, "Milk, we could live a little longer." Jedediah's voice was raspy but clear. "Jedediah, I know times are hard. I know your stock's gone, your well's near dry. I've got something to trade." He tugged the cow's rope, leading it forward. The animal mooed softly, its bones sharp beneath its hide. Still, it was alive. "Jedediah, measured, slow this cow, for your daughter." The words fell like stones into the silence. Mary froze where she stood. Her mother's face blanched white. Silas opened his mouth, then shut it again. Mary, trembling, "Father." Silas, gruffly, eyes avoiding hers, "Go inside, Mary." But she didn't. She stood rooted to the ground, her heart pounding in her ears. Jedediah adjusted his hat, his eyes never leaving Silas. "Jedediah, I'll treat her fair. She'll have food, a roof, a bed to sleep in. Better than the hunger that's coming here." Anna's hands trembled as she reached for Silas's arm. Anna, whispering, desperate, "Silas, the boy needs milk. We need milk." Silas looked at his son, then at the cow, then finally at Mary. His face was lined with torment, torn between the daughter he loved and the family that would surely starve without help. That night, after Jedediah left them with the offer to think on it, the Johnson family sat in their dim, lantern-lit kitchen. The cow stood outside, a shadow against the moonlight, tethered as if waiting for their answer. Mary sat stiff in her chair, her braid falling over her shoulder, her hands clenched in her lap. "Mary," breaking the silence, "you can't. You can't give me to him." Anna, pleading, "Mary, child, you're strong. You could survive it. Better than the rest of us without that cow." Mary, choking, angry, "Survive? With him? He's old, Mama. He's older than Grandpapa was when he died. You trade me for a cow." Her little brother, too young to understand the weight of it, looked at her with wide eyes. "Sam, Mary, I don't want to lose you." Silas slammed his fist on the table, his voice breaking. "Silas, Don't you think I know what I'm a skin? Don't you think I'd give my own life first? But what's a man to do when his family's starving? This land's cursed. We can't feed ourselves, and the boy's ribs are showing through his skin. If one cow means life, then... His voice cracked, and he turned away. Mary stared at the lantern flame, her chest tight, her throat dry. She had always dreamed of choosing her own husband someday. A young ranch hand maybe, or a townsman with steady work. Not this. Not a man older than her father. But when she looked at her brother, at her mother's hollow cheeks, at her father's bent shoulders, she felt the trap of it closing in. That night, long after her family slept, Mary sat by the window, staring out at the cow tied to the post. The animal's soft lowing drifted through the still air, and in the distance, she could see Jedediah Crow's silhouette under the moon, sitting on a stump, waiting. Her heart ached. She whispered into the darkness, though no one could hear. Mary, whispering, Lord, don't make me do this. Don't let them give me away, not for a cow. But in Bitter Creek, prayers were swallowed by dust. The lantern burning low, the Johnson family restless in their beds, and Mary awake in the darkness, knowing her fate was no longer her own. A week later, the church bell rang low across the prairie, but there was no joy in its toll. The people of Bitter Creek gathered, dust on their boots, hunger in their eyes, whispering as they filled the wooden pews of the clapboard church. Everyone knew what this day meant. Inside, the air was thick with heat and murmurs. The preacher stood at the altar, his Bible clutched tight, his face pale as though he wished to be anywhere but here. Jedediah Crow stood in front of him, straight back despite his age, his black suit brushed clean though moth-eaten at the edges. His hands, veined and knotted, rested on the head of his cane. His sharp gray eyes scanned the room, but gave nothing away. At the back of the church, the Johnson family sat huddled. Silas's jaw was clenched, his arm around Anna, who dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Little Sam swung his legs restlessly, not fully understanding, but sensing the heaviness around him. And there was Mary, 17 years old, her hair pulled back in a braid, her face pale beneath a veil of lace yellowed with age. She wore her mother's wedding dress. Mended in so many places, it was more patchwork than fabric. The dress hung loose on her frame, and though she stood tall, her hands shook as she gripped the hem. The church fell silent as she stepped into the aisle. Every eye turned toward her. Every whisper rose and fell like the sound of locusts. Whispered townsfolk, 17, and sold for a cow. God have mercy. Old Kroll, bury her like the others. Mary heard every word. She forced her steps forward, one by one, each like a stone tied to her feet. When she reached the altar, she dared one glance at Jedediah. His face was unreadable, lined with age, but not cruel. He nodded slightly, as if to say, "You'll live now." The preacher cleared his throat, his voice thin and unsteady. "Preacher, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and man to join this man, Jedediah Crow, and this woman, Mary Johnson, in holy matrimony." His voice faltered, eyes flicking nervously over the townsfolk, who stared with a mix of pity and disdain. Mary's eyes stung with tears. She kept her chin high, but her heart was pounding, trapped between shame and fear. The vows came slowly, heavy as chains. "Preacher, do you, Jedediah Crow, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Jedediah's voice was steady. "Jedediah, I do." The words echoed in Mary's ears. The preacher turned to her. "Preacher, and do you, Mary Johnson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Mary's throat closed. For a moment, she could not speak. Her eyes darted to her father, who sat stiff as stone, unable to look at her. Her mother's lips trembled in silent prayer. Little Sam stared at her with pleading eyes. Her chest rose and fell, the silence stretching. The townsfolk leaned in, whispering. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a breath, she forced the words out. "Mary, I do." The preacher nodded quickly, eager to finish. "Preacher, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." A hush fell over the room. Jedediah turned to her. For a moment, Mary braced herself, dread tightening her stomach. But the old man only bowed his head, not touching her lips. His voice was low, almost gentle. Jedediah, she'll be safe with me. Gasps rippled through the pews. The preacher closed his Bible. The ceremony was over. Outside, the hot sun burned down as the church doors opened. Mary stepped into the light, her hand resting on Jedediah's arm. Behind them, Silas led the cow by a rope, the animal lowing softly, ribs sticking out, but still a miracle compared to the hunger at home. The Johnson family did not walk Mary to the wagon. They did not kiss her goodbye. They only clung to the cow, whispering words of relief as they touched its hide. Mary turned, hoping for one last glance of love, of regret, of anything from her parents. But Silas avoided her gaze, and Anna pressed her face into the cow's flank, weeping. Little Sam broke free, running to her. He threw his thin arms around her waist. Sam, crying, "Don't go, Mary. Don't leave me." Mary bent down, clutching him, kissing the top of his dusty hair. Mary, whispering, "I'll see you again, Sam. Be strong for Mama." Jedediah's shadow fell over them. His voice, though rough, was patient. "Jedediah, time to go, girl." Mary pulled away from her brother, her heart shattering with each step. She climbed into Jedediah's wagon. The reins snapped, the wheels turned, and the church faded into the distance. Dust rose behind them as Bitter Creek watched her go, sold for a cow, riding into a future she had not chosen. Inside, Mary sat stiff beside Jedediah, the dry wind whipping her veil away. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, fighting back tears. Jedediah glanced at her only once, then looked back to the horizon. "Jedediah, quietly, you'll have a roof, food, work, and I won't lay a hand on you unless you wish it. That's my word." Mary turned to him, startled, but his eyes were fixed on the road, his face solemn. The wagon rolled on toward his ranch, toward a life she never asked for. And behind them, her family led their cow back home, their bellies saved, their daughter gone. Bitter Creek outskirts, Jedediah Crow's ranch. The wagon creaked and groaned as it rattled across the open prairie. Hours had passed since the church, and the sun was beginning its slow fall toward the horizon. The air was cooler now, tinted gold, the shadows of grass stretching long and thin. Mary sat stiff on the wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look at Jedediah. She didn't speak. Her veil had blown away hours earlier, and her braid hung loose, strands of hair whipping in the wind. At last, the wagon rolled into a lonely clearing. A sagging ranch house stood against the sky, 2 stories of gray boards weathered by storms, with shutters hanging crooked and a porch in need of repair. Behind it, a small barn leaned precariously, and beyond that, fields of dry, cracked earth stretched as far as the eye could see. Jedediah reined in the horses, the wagon jolting to a halt. He climbed down slowly, joints creaking with the weight of his years, then offered Mary his hand. She hesitated but stepped down without taking it. He didn't press her. "Jedediah," nodding at the house, "it ain't much, but it'll hold the wind out. Supper's inside. You'll be hungry." Mary followed him up the porch steps. The door squealed as he pushed it open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of wood smoke and pine tar. The furniture was simple, a heavy oak table, a few chairs, a stone hearth with the remains of a fire. A kettle hung above the coals, steam faintly rising. Jedediah removed his hat, hung it on a peg, and leaned his cane against the wall. "Jedediah, there's rooms upstairs. One's mine. One can be yours. I don't aim to share unless you say so." Mary froze at the words. She had expected, no, dreaded, something else entirely. Her face flushed hot, though she couldn't meet his gaze. "Mary, hesitant, you mean?" "Jedediah, firmly, I meant what I said in the church. I didn't bring you here to take what ain't mine. You'll have your space. You'll have your choice. Always." He busied himself with the kettle, ladling out stew into 2 tin bowls. The smell of beans and salt pork filled the air. It was meager, but compared to the hunger of her family's home, it seemed a feast. Mary sat across from him at the table. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of spoons. She ate slowly, her eyes flicking up to him, studying him. His face was weathered, carved deep with lines, his beard coarse and tangled. But his eyes, though sharp, held no malice. After supper, Jedediah stood, his movements deliberate, and set a worn book on the table. "Jedediah, can you read?" Mary blinked at him, startled. "Mary, a little. Mama taught me some words from the good book. But not much." Jedediah, nodding, "Then we'll fix that. World's bigger than Bitter Creek. You ought to know it." He lit a lantern, the flame flickering across the walls, and opened the book. His voice was gravelly but steady as he read aloud a passage, tracing the words with a gnarled finger. Then he pushed the book toward her. Mary hesitated, then followed the letters with her eyes, stumbling through the words. She flushed with embarrassment when she misread, but Jedediah only nodded, patient. "Jedediah, slow's fine. Better slow and true than quick and lost." For the first time since the church, Mary felt something strange stirring in her chest. Not comfort exactly, but the faintest edge of trust. Later, he showed her to her room upstairs. The bed was small but neatly made, with a quilt folded at the foot. A window looked out over the dark fields, where the wind whistled low. "Jedediah, at the door, you'll be safe here. Tomorrow you'll see to the chickens, maybe the garden. We'll make do." Mary stood in the middle of the room, her hands trembling at her sides. "Mary," quietly, almost a whisper, "why me? Why take me at all?" Jedediah's hand paused on the doorframe. His voice was low, heavy. "Jedediah, 'cause your folks were starving, and I know what it is to watch the people you love waste away. I couldn't let that girl die with the rest of Bitter Creek." He didn't wait for her reply. He stepped out, leaving her in silence. Mary sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards. Her chest was tight, her mind torn between anger, grief, and a confusing, reluctant gratitude. Downstairs, she heard Jedediah's boots pacing, then the creak of his chair by the fire. She lay back, staring at the ceiling beams until her eyes blurred with tears. That night, in Jedediah Crow's ranch house, Mary did not sleep easily. But she realized something that unsettled her even more than fear. He had not touched her. He had not tried. And in that strange mercy, her hatred began to soften into something else she did not yet understand. Bitter Creek, Kansas. Early autumn, late 1800s. The wind was cooler now, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and the faintest hope of rain. But Bitter Creek was still hungry. Dust still gathered on window panes, children still coughed through the night, and cattle still fell one by one on the prairie. Mary Crow, though the name still caught bitter in her throat, walked down the main street of Bitter Creek with a basket of eggs under her arm. The hem of her dress brushed the dirt road. Her chin held high, though her heart thudded with every step. Whispers followed her like shadows. At the blacksmith's, two women with bonnets tilted their heads together, eyes flicking toward her. Woman 1, "Hush, there she is, the girl sold for a cow." Woman 2, scoffing, "No better than cattle herself." At the mercantile, ranch hands leaned against the hitching rail, smirking. Ranch hand 1, "How's life with your grandpappy, girl? Does he tuck you in at night?" Ranch hand 2, snickering, "Careful, he might break a hip." Laughter followed her like stones thrown at her back. Mary's face flushed crimson, but she did not stop. She walked into the mercantile, placed her eggs on the counter, and met the shopkeeper's eyes squarely. Mary, steadily, though her voice trembled, 10 cents a dozen. Same as always. The shopkeeper shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the men outside, then nodded and counted out the coins. He didn't meet her gaze again. When Mary stepped back outside, her hands shook as she tucked the coins into her basket. The ranch hands were still there, smirking, waiting for her to flinch. She kept walking, her eyes straight ahead. But inside, her humiliation burned hotter than the sun overhead. That evening, back at the ranch, she slammed the basket down harder than she meant to. Jedediah looked up from his chair by the hearth, where he was mending a bridle. "Jedediah, calmly, what soured you, girl? Mary spun on him, her eyes flashing with tears she didn't want to shed. Mary, snapping, don't you know what they call me? Don't you hear them? They laugh, Jedediah. They laugh at me, your child bride. They think I'm no better than the cow you traded for me. Her voice cracked, her shoulders heaving. She expected him to bark at her, to scold her for her sharp tongue. Instead, he set the bridle aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes steady on hers. Jedediah, I know what they say. I've heard it all my life. They said I was cursed when my first wife died, birthing a son that never drew breath. They said it again when the second passed from fever, and when the third wasted away before my eyes. They said death sat at my table. I buried them all with my own hands while folks whispered. His voice was low, rough with memory. Mary's anger faltered as she listened. Jedediah, after a pause, truth is, girl, folks will talk no matter what. They talk 'cause it keeps them from looking at their own misery. And in Bitter Creek, misery's thick as dust. Mary swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes, though she tried to hide them. Mary, softly, but why me? Why take me at all? You knew what they'd say. Jedediah leaned back, his gaze distant, as if he were speaking to ghosts. Jedediah, because I seen the look in your pa's eyes, the same look I had once. The look of a man watching the people he loved starve. And I couldn't stomach letting another girl waste away 'cause men were too proud or too poor to save her. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mary lowered herself into the chair opposite him. She stared at the flames, chewing on his words. Mary, barely a whisper, you don't own me? Jedediah, firmly no. You're here 'cause it give you a chance at living. And one day, when you're grown enough, if you want to go, then go you shall. I ain't your chains, Mary. I'm your shelter. Her throat tightened. She had braced herself for cruelty, for the leering hand of an old man claiming his bride. Instead, she found a kind of broken honor she didn't know how to face. That night, when she lay awake in her narrow bed, she thought not of the jeers in town, but of the sorrow in Jedediah's voice as he spoke of burying 3 wives. For the first time, she saw him not as a monster who bought her, but as a man who had carried grief heavier than hers. And though she still longed for freedom, she felt a strange stirring of respect, something fragile, like a seed pressing through dry earth. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the shutters, carrying with it the rumors of Bitter Creek. But inside the ranch house, Mary began to hear another voice, a voice that said perhaps this fate was not only chains, but also a kind of unexpected mercy. The nights in Bitter Creek grew colder as autumn crept in, bringing a brittle chill that cracked through the silence. Inside the cabin, a small fire crackled low in the hearth, its glow catching on the old stranger's lined face as he sat in his rocker. Mary sat on the floor nearby, mending one of his shirts by lantern light. For days now, her feelings had twisted in ways she could hardly name. At first, she had hated him, this man she had been bound to without choice. But hate was a fire that burned out quick in the silence of the prairie. What replaced it was confusion, because the old stranger, his name, she had finally learned, was Elias Boone, did not behave like the monster she had been warned men could be. He was quiet, patient. He gave her space, never demanding what her family had already given him. Instead, he worked from dawn till dusk, his hands cracked and raw as he tended the little he had, and always left the choicest portion of supper for her. That night, Mary's needle trembled in her fingers as she finally spoke what had sat in her chest too long. "Why me?" she asked, her voice soft as the night wind. Elias did not look up from whittling the bit of wood in his hands. His knife scraped slow, measured. "Why you what? Why take me? Why not choose a woman closer to your age, or one who wanted it?" The knife stopped. For the first time, Elias looked at her, and Mary was struck by the sadness in his eyes. They were pale like winter skies, full of storms that had long since passed, but never really left. He set the knife down, leaning forward. His voice came low, rough with years of memory. "Mary, I never asked for this. I told your father I'd help him with seed grain. He said he'd nothing left to give but you. I told him no. Elias's hand closed tight around the wood, his knuckles white. But he insisted. He pressed me, said it was the only way his family would make it through winter. I took you because I knew if I didn't, someone else would. Someone who might not treat you kind. Mary's breath caught. She stared at him, her heart thundering against her ribs. You mean you didn't want this either? Elias gave a weary half-smile. I wanted a companion, yes. A soul to share the last of my years. But not like this. Not by force. His eyes softened. And not with someone who still has a whole life ahead of her. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the pop of the fire. Mary blinked, her throat tightening as hot tears stung her eyes. For the first time since she'd been led across the dry prairie to his door, she saw him not as a stranger, not as an old man who had taken her away, but as something else entirely, a man burdened by loneliness, trying to do right in a world that had gone so wrong. She whispered, almost too low to hear, "Then what am I to you?" Elias rose slowly, his joints creaking like old wood. He set a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch trembling but careful, as though he feared to break her. "You're not my possession, Mary. You're my guest. You'll always be safe here. If you choose to stay, you'll have a roof, food, and a place to belong. But if one day you decide to go," his voice faltered, then steadied again, "I'll not stop you." Mary's heart swelled painfully. Her fingers knotted the fabric in her lap. She wanted to speak, to say something, thank you, or I don't know what I want yet, but her voice failed. Instead, she only nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks unchecked. Elias gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, then turned back to his chair. The firelight traced his worn profile, and Mary realized something that shook her deeply. This old stranger had more kindness in him than her own kin. That night, she lay awake long after Elias's breathing had gone steady with sleep. The wind clawed at the windows, and the prairie groaned in its thirst. But inside the little cabin, for the first time, Mary felt a glimmer of something she hadn't dared hold on to in weeks. Hope. The days in Bitter Creek did not soften, but Mary did. She rose with the dawn beside Elias, her skirts trailing dust as she followed him to the barn. He taught her to hitch the mule, to mend a fence line, to carry water without spilling half of it. At first her hands blistered, her back ached, but she did not complain. Slowly, the blisters became calluses, and the girl who had been traded for a cow began to look like a woman who could command the land. Elias never treated her as less. When she worked, he worked beside her. When she grew tired, he shouldered the heavier load without a word. He never raised his voice, never pressed her, never asked for the rights most men would have claimed. And in that quiet, steady way, something grew between them that neither had expected. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Mary stood at the porch rail, her eyes on the dying light. Elias came up beside her, his boots heavy on the boards. "You've taken to this life," he said softly. Mary smiled faintly. "I've had to. Bitter Creek doesn't let anyone rest." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound, but it was warm. "You're tougher than I figured." Mary turned her head, studying him. The lines on his face were deep, carved by years of wind and loss. But his eyes held a gentleness that disarmed her. "And you're kinder than I figured," she admitted. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but full of something unspoken. Elias looked away, his jaw tightening, as though fighting words he longed to say. That night, Mary lay awake again, her heart troubled. She thought of Elias's patience, his quiet sacrifice, his promise that she was free if she wished it. And she wondered, was freedom what she truly wanted anymore? But peace on the prairie is a fragile thing. 3 days later, trouble arrived in the form of her own blood. Mary was feeding the hens when she heard the crunch of wagon wheels on the hard earth. Dust plumed up behind 2 wagons rolling slow and heavy toward the cabin. Her breath caught in her chest. She knew that wagon. Her father. The door creaked open behind her, and Elias stepped out, his face hardening when he saw. Mary's stomach churned with dread as the wagons drew near. Her father climbed down first, his clothes hanging loose from famine, his eyes sharp with a desperation that frightened her more than hunger ever had. "Well," he spat, looking from Elias to Mary. "You fattened up in this place." Mary's mouth went dry. She wanted to speak, but Elias stepped forward, his tall frame planted like an oak tree between her and the men. "What do you want?" Elias's voice was low, steady. Her father gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Another cow, and flour, sugar, salt. We're starving, Boone. You got a roof, food, a young girl to keep you warm. You can spare it." Mary's chest tightened with fury. She had been bartered once, and here he was again, ready to sell her piece by piece if it meant his survival. Elias didn't flinch. "I've nothing to give you. You've got her." Her father's gaze darted to Mary, cold as a rattler's stare. "We made a bargain. She's worth more than one cow. You'll give us what we ask, or we'll take her back." Mary's legs trembled. Behind her, Elias shifted, and she saw the subtle move of his hand resting near the old rifle by the porch. For the first time, Mary felt the truth strike deep in her bones. Elias Boone was not her captor. He was her shield, and if her father pressed this standoff, the prairie would drink blood before Elias let them harm her. The dry wind howled through Bitter Creek as silence stretched thin, ready to snap. The prairie held its breath. Dust swirled low around the boots of the men who had come with Mary's father. Their gaunt faces told the truth of hunger, but their eyes gleamed with something harsher than need, greed. Elias Boone stood firm on the porch, the rifle in his grip steady despite the tremor of age in his joints. Mary hovered behind him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I'll say this once," Elias growled, his voice like gravel. "Mary is not for trade. Not for cows. Not for grain. Not for anything. She stays here because she chooses to, not because you forced her." Her father sneered. "She's my blood. I'll decide what's best for her." "Step aside, old man." Something snapped inside Mary. All the months of silence, of being treated as currency, of watching her family's hunger twist into cruelty, it came boiling to the surface. She shoved past Elias, her voice shaking but sharp as a whip. "No!" The word cracked across the yard like thunder. All eyes turned to her. She stood tall, her chin high, though her knees trembled. "You traded me for a cow as though I were nothing," she spat, her voice rising. "But here I found kindness. Here I've been given respect. You will not take me back. I am not your bargaining chip anymore. I am my own." Her father's face darkened. He took a step forward, his hand raised as though to strike her, an old habit. But before his palm could fall, Elias lifted the rifle and cocked it. The sharp click froze the air. "Touch her," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, "and it'll be the last thing you do." The other men shifted uneasily. Hunger made men dangerous, but a man with nothing to lose was more dangerous still, and Elias looked every bit the kind who meant his words. Mary's father hesitated, his hand trembling in the air. Then, with a snarl, he dropped it. "You'll regret this," he spat, climbing back onto the wagon. "Winter's coming, and kindness won't fill your belly." The wagons rolled away, leaving only a cloud of dust and the pounding of Mary's heart. She turned to Elias, her eyes wet, her breath uneven. "You stood for me." Elias lowered the rifle, his shoulders sagging with the weight of it all. He looked at her, his pale eyes filled with something he tried to hide. "Mary, I'd stand for you 1,000 times over. But what matters is this. Do you want to stay?" Silence hung heavy. Mary searched his face, the man who had never touched her without care, who had worked beside her as an equal, who had protected her when her own kin turned against her. And in that silence, she knew her answer. She stepped closer, her small hand reaching for his weathered one. Her voice was soft but steady. "I don't stay because I must. I stay because I choose you." Elias's breath caught. His hand trembled in hers, and for a long moment he could only stare at her, as though the weight of years and loneliness were breaking all at once. Then, slowly, he pulled her into his arms. His embrace was gentle, reverent, as though he held not a girl traded for a cow, but a woman who had chosen to give him her heart. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and unending, harsh and unforgiving. But inside that little cabin, Under a roof patched with care, something rare bloomed. Love not born of bargain or desperation, but of choice. And in Bitter Creek, Kansas, where land cracked and cattle died, Mary and Elias began a life that no drought could take away.